And welcome to the CRM MVP podcast, episode number 44. This is the first episode of 2019. So I'm really excited to be here and talk to you about, a topic that is super important for me, and it's also super important for a lot of solution architects out there, which is user interface. And what I wanted to do today and for this episode is to essentially talk about all of the best practices that I follow when it comes to setting up the user interface. Now, I realize that these best practices, just like we've seen before in some episodes that have been a little controversial, are my best practices. These are not something that everyone can follow, but I definitely recommend them because they seem to work for me. These are some best practices that I've sort of evolved over time. I didn't really follow these from the beginning. From once I became a solution architect, they sort of evolve over time, and I think that if you ask me a few years from now, I'll probably have amendments to these best practices because as things come out, we have to adapt to them and sort of manage these changes. So, as I mentioned, I'm recording this episode at the beginning of 2019. This is the first episode of 2019, and because of that, we're currently working on the unified interface, for example. So, on previous episodes, I've mentioned how big of a fan I am of the unified interface and how much I like to implement it and how much I recommend people to stick to the unified interface, especially if they're implementing Dynamics 365 right now, if they're planning on going live in 2019, for example, for a variety of reasons. I think that the new interface not only is the future, it's the interface that is going to be there to stay and not the current web interface or the legacy interface, if you want to call it that way. But at the same time, because it was created with different technology, with mobile technology in mind, it loads much faster. And initially when you load it up for the first time, it takes a little while to get things going and caching and whatnot. But once things are cached, I mean, it's super, super fast. It's lightning fast. And I realized that for users who have been using Dynamics for a while, users that perhaps came from previous versions of Dynamics 365, it will be interesting for them to be able to adapt to the new interface. But right now I'm doing multiple implementations at once that are for users that have never been in Dynamics. Some of them are coming from other CRM platforms where they had never really used Dynamics before. I'm actually doing a couple of projects that are for organizations that never really had a Dynamics or a CRM solution per se. Not a dynamic solution or a competitor. They were sort of using, Outlook and Excel and those applications, I guess, and essentially personal memory to be able to manage their customer relationships. They don't have a whole lot of accounts. Every sales rep didn't have a whole lot of accounts, so they try to keep everything in mind. But again, they went through a couple of instances in which the sales person left the company, and obviously with him or her went all of the knowledge about those accounts, and bolts were dropped and customers were unhappy, and that's something that we try to avoid. And that's why organizations get solutions like Dynamics 365 and other CRM systems, is to prevent situations like that. So what I wanted to do again is talk about the user interface, and there is just no way right now to go through that without really addressing the unified interface, which is the current interface that we have, and talk about some of the pitfalls that we currently have, because that's another thing. And I mentioned in previous episodes that I'm a big fan of the unified interface. I think that you should be implementing that, as I mentioned. But I do get some messages once in a while, either comments left at the crmmvppodcast.com website or emails that people send me directly to info@crmmvppodcast.com, where I get essentially messages about pointing out some of these deficiencies. And I pull up a couple of them and I'll read them to you just so you can have an idea. Perhaps you haven't run into some of these issues, I would call them. I don't really think they're issues. I think that they are the result of a solution that is still finding its ground, and that's why it hasn't really become the UI permanently, that we still have the web interface, and it's clear that it's going to be deprecated. We are not I personally don't feel comfortable sort of putting my foot on the ground and saying that by October, November, whenever that release comes out, it will be gone or it will be completely deprecated. I don't know. I think that we're still quite a ways there. But again, I haven't really seen what Microsoft, and what I've seen I can talk about what Microsoft is coming up in April, and the release after April, right? So we'll see what comes up. But the fact that all of the administration, for example, takes place on the web interface makes me a little skeptical about the fact that we'll be ready to go when it comes to the UI, the new UI, the unified interface becoming the only interface going forward. I don't know what's going to happen within the next year or within this year, 2019. Maybe, we'll be 100% ready to go a couple of releases from now, and that will be really cool. And of course, there are some other tools that are coming out. If you saw the news within the last 30 days, we've seen great advancements, especially on the area of Power Apps and customizations. For example, the new form editor that was released on the Power App side looks amazing. So I think that a lot of the administration will transfer out of Dynamics 365 to begin with. I think that the fact that we're seeing the new form editor is a good indication of where the UI is going, and that there's a lot of other features and functionalities that we don't have access to yet that perhaps are taking it away from Dynamics 365. Like, for example, maybe the entire email management and document management sections, and maybe data management sections, like all of those things that already exist on the Power BI, on the Power App side, but we haven't seen it yet. So they might be released any time. And I'm excited about that. But as of now, what I'm trying to do is encouraging people to go into the unified interface because it is improving. So again, a couple of issues that I've read somewhere, or that have been reported to me via email. For example, the fact that there are a few items within the security roles that don't seem to affect the new UI. They affect the web interface, but they don't affect the unified interface. So for example, even if you give people permission to create personal views or personal dashboards, you won't be able to do it. But the reason for that is because in some cases, the dashboards cannot be personal. So like that security role, even though it exists, that security role permission, even though it exists, it only affects the web interface. So interactive dashboards, for example, they can only be system dashboards. You cannot create personal interactive dashboards. So again, that security role doesn't seem to have any effect. If you have, someone send me an email with a lot of information about customer service. They're doing a project on the customer service side and share some frustrations. For example, the fact that if you add queue monitors into tiles within the dashboard, you can see the items in the queue, which is exactly what you want. The emails, the cases, whatever might be on that queue that you're monitoring, but there's no name for the queue. So if you have a queue name high priority or development, items or whatever, you see all the cases in it, but you can tell if this is the high priority queue or if this is development queue or if this is whatever queue. Like there's no queue name, right? So you can monitor the queue as long as you know what queue it is. Which again, I think that the side step to that could be, well, if you name your dashboard high priority customer service and you have a queue in there, you sort of can understand that the queue that you're monitoring is the high priority cases queue. But at the same time, why wouldn't you show a name of a queue? Another thing, for example, on the interactive dashboards we were just talking about, we don't have the same date operators to filter the interactive dashboards like we're used to in the web interface on the web client. When you go to Advanced Find and you pick a date field, you have 40 or 50 different operators. There's so many of them, right? You have last 30 days, last 7 days, last 3 days, last X days. You have so many of them, whereas we have limitations on the operators we can use when it comes to filtering interactive dashboards. Like, for example, you have this month, last month, but there's no last 30 days, for example. So what if I want a rolling 30 days? Why are you forcing me to pick last month or this month, right? What if I just want to see the last 30 days? So there are a couple of I don't want to call them issues. I think they're shortcomings or things that are missing on the new UI. But by the time the web interface is completely deprecated and the UI becomes the go-to UI, right? The default UI of Dynamics 365, I think all these problems will be gone. There won't be any shortcomings. They will be added to it. And perhaps the current version that they're testing right now, it already works. Everything works perfect, and they haven't released it to the public. So we'll see what happens when the April release comes out. We'll see what happens when the next release comes out. Again, there are several things that you are sort of like missing and that you expect them there, and they're not there. But that's only for a small period of time. I can't imagine this lasting, this being a permanent thing. Like the fact that you cannot create personal dashboards or personal views, that's something that has to be there. So they will be, adding this functionality later on. I have to assume that's coming. So because of that, I don't want to shut down the new UI just because of things that might be missing. But I do want to talk about my approach to the user interface from the solution architect perspective. And what I mean by that is that I think that there are a lot of best practices when it comes to the user interface that are wrong. And these are, I'm not stranger to criticizing industry best practices. I already did that for episode number 20 when I talked about 20 industry best practices I disagree with. And I think that there's a lot of UI best practices that I completely disagree with. And that, I think that there's a better approach to it, and there's an approach that I learned by perhaps following the industry best practice and then realizing there was a better way to do it. Number one, I think the overall focus when it comes to the user interface is flawed. And I've talked about this, I think it was on that same episode, number 20, when I talked about the fact that I think people focus too much on the technical requirements rather than performance. They don't focus in performance enough. I think that when you work with your customer, and we understand that the customer is always right and the customer will get what they want regardless. I think that when you work with your customer, and it's up to your customer to decide what makes it to the UI, and all you're doing is just checking a box. All you're doing is saying, okay, if this is what you want, I'm going to do it. I think that you get into a position where you're designing for essentially technical requirements. You're designing for the solution itself, but you're not designing for performance. I'll give you an example. It's always interesting when I get to work with customers that work with other partners out there or self-deployed, and they are complaining about, why is the UI so slow? But then you notice that they have, like 4 different iframes loading every time they open a record, right? Iframes, you're essentially loading a site within a site within a site. So if you have a whole lot of processing, maybe that was a technical requirement that when you open a form, you need to see 4 different iframes with a bunch of information. Maybe that is something the users want to see, but the users are not thinking about performance. The users are all thinking about, what would be convenient for me. And I think that as solution architects, we have to keep that mindset of performance first. And you guys, if you listen to this podcast series, you're no stranger to the fact that for me, performance is always first. We talk about it on like almost every episode. We talk about performance and how important it is. So because of that, I think that the user interface should be about performance. Now, here's the caveat to this. When we talk about performance, for example, on the episode 19, which was about security, we talk about performance from the point of view of really navigating the application. How can we better set this thing up? And the episode was called Setting Up Security as an MVP. How can we set up the system to maximize performance? So when I navigate from entity to entity, when I go into a view or whatever it is, the system is not sluggish. The system is not spending a whole lot of time trying to figure out what do I have access to and what records to show me and what buttons I can click on, right? We want to make sure that the system performs as fast as possible without really getting to a point where you just make everyone system administrator, right? So we talked about the fact that best practice is you want to keep security as simple as possible so it performs better. However, not too simple, not give everyone system administrator. We still have to dial it back and make it secure. But when we decide what is the minimum amount of security we're going to put in place, our main job at that point is to make sure that we implement a solution that is as simple as possible, because that way it performs better. It performs faster for the users. So performance should always be number one. But when it comes to the user interface, performance is not all about what's the fastest way to do something. And I think that if there's something that you're going to get from this episode is that when I talk about performance, I'm talking about what allows you to have a better experience when it comes to leveraging Dynamics 365 or anything within Dynamics 365. Performance focus when it comes to Power Apps, for example, might not be about what's the fastest way to load a mobile app. Maybe the fastest way to load a mobile app or a Power App will be to have a super simple app that doesn't do anything. It's a read-only, list of things. That is a useless app, perhaps. Maybe it's useful, but for the most part, if your app doesn't do anything, yeah, it will load super fast, but it doesn't really accomplish what the app is supposed to do. So because of that, even though it loads faster, it doesn't mean that it performs better, right? So it's the same principle with the user interface. And I'll give you a lot of pointers when it comes to how do you keep a performance-first focus when it comes to designing your user interface without really thinking too much about what's the fastest way to do it. Faster doesn't mean that it performs better. And I'll talk about that. For example, first point, when we think about performing user interface, when I think about implementing a user interface with a performance focus or performance first, I think about the most effective interface to enable my users to do their jobs and to enable the company to beat competition, to sell more, to keep those customers happier and keep them coming back. That's what I'm thinking about. And I've mentioned this, again, I think it was on episode number 20 when we talked about best practices I don't follow. And I think I talked about the best practice that people have of putting themselves on the shoes of the users when it comes to designing a user interface. So for those of you who listen to that episode and remember this will be kind of a repeat of that, but it's relevant because we're talking about the user interface. So the idea here is that a lot of solution architects and a lot of people implementing Dynamics 365 believe that in order for you to create an effective user interface, you need to put yourself on your user's shoes. And although that's not 100% wrong, that's not 100% the bad way to do it. The bad way to do it is to not even think about your users. But the best way to do it is to put yourself on the shoes of your customers' customers, right? So, and I think I used the example of an insurance company on episode number 20. So if I'm deploying Dynamics 365 for an insurance company, I want to think about what kind of experience, what kind of interactions do I expect as a customer of this insurance company when I call the insurance company to report a crash, for example? What kind of experience do I get, as a customer of that insurance company when I'm calling in to, or maybe as a prospect when I'm calling in to try to buy a new policy? That's what I'm thinking about, is how do I maximize the UI so the experience for the prospects and the customers is the best possible experience. So I'm constantly putting myself on the shoes of my customers' customers, right? So I'm thinking about if it's a bank, for example, if I'm trying to open an account or cash a check or make a deposit or whatever it is, I want to make sure that my experience is the best it can be. Okay, and that's why we see case studies like Metrobank, for example, how they focus 100% in providing great experience to their customers, and that's why they continue to grow and grow as one of the as one of the banks in the UK. So as you work with customers, and I'm doing this with the implementations that I'm working on right now, I look at their customer base and I think about what kind of experience will your customers expect, and that tells me how the UI should be designed and put in place. Because if I can make the customers of my customers happy and keep coming and buying, that means that UI will be effective. It means that salespeople will sell more, will keep the customers coming back, right, to get those services. So because of that, the system will be adopted. And we talked about this on the last episode, episode 43, when we talked about effective solutions versus ineffective solutions, right? So again, putting yourself in the shoes of the users is not a bad thing, but putting yourself in the shoes of the customers of your customers is even better. So that is one step that you need to take if you want to make sure that your solution, your user interface solution, the user interface you're going to put in place is effective. And this has to go along with the whole idea of not being a whiteboard consultant. And I've talked about this in the past as well, where I call whiteboard consultants those consultants or solution architects that essentially sit down on a whiteboard, or well, they don't sit down on a whiteboard, but they sort of stand up next to a whiteboard and they ask their customer, what do you want me to do? Like, how many buttons you want? How many fields you want? How many iframes you want? How do you want the form to behave? What kind of pop-ups do you like? Right? Those are almost always bad user interfaces because the customers don't understand, again, the repercussions of adding all this gibberish, all of these, CRM Christmas tree-like behavior to forms, right? That's why I'm not a big fan of all of those little solutions that seem to be harmless. Like, oh, we have a solution that, it does a quick search on every entity, and we're going to drop that in the form. Oh, by the way, you don't need to click on your document management section within the entity. We're going to drop an iframe that shows you the documents right on the form, and little by little, you install 7 or 8 of those little apps, and now your forms and your UI is awful. Right? Because again, you're not thinking from the user perspective. You think there's no consequences on adding all of this functionality in place. And I feel that if you are not a whiteboard consultant, you will be in a position to say, I understand that that's something that you would like to have, but that's going to cause a problem in the system. And I just don't think we should go that way. Now, I think, again, the customer is always, they have the final word. They're right? But I guess it all depends on how you approach the implementation. I spend a lot of time up front, sort of creating that relationship in which customers understand that I happen to be the expert in Dynamics 365 and business applications. You happen to be the expert in your business, in your industry. You are the expert on that. So if we come together and we bring our expertise, together, we're going to come up with the best solution. So I get to make essentially all of the decisions when it comes to Dynamics 365 and the user interface and the technical side of it and how do we integrate to things and what tools to use. I will make that decision because first and foremost, my number one concern and my number one priority is to implement an effective solution. So I'm never going to recommend something that is going to put that in jeopardy on purpose. Right? I'm always going to focus on doing something that will make my solution effective and adopted. So because of that, I always focus on making sure that the customers understand that, look, I've spent the last 12 years or 13 years or whatever it is, depending on when you're listening to this, implementing this thing. I've learned many ways of doing it, and I'm always going to recommend what I consider to be the best way to do it. Now, obviously, the customer, again, they can take it or leave it from there, but hopefully you established credibility and rapport from the beginning. So that's the kind of relationship that you have. So again, don't be a whiteboard consultant. Don't ask your customers, what do you want me to do? That is not what you're getting paid for, right? And again, I totally realize I've been in those projects before. I cannot say that every single implementation I've ever done, it's been with a customer that, understood that. I'm really lucky to right now be working with a group of customers that are amazing, and they are 100% on board with the fact that they're going to leverage my expertise in Dynamics while I leverage their expertise in their business, and we're going to come up with amazing solutions because of it. But in the past, and when I work with other partners, that wasn't the case, right? I work with companies that they said, straight up to my face, why don't you do what I'm paying you to do, which is what I say. And those projects almost never went well. And I always regretted that. I always regretted that we couldn't just say, we're not going to do that. I understand you have 3 users and you want to go on premise, but I don't think you should go on premise. And why can't we put our foot down on that? And again, I realize that people listening to this, you might not be in a position where you can say no, but as much as possible, try to focus on not being a whiteboard consultant. If you understand that that's the best choice to go with, with whatever you believe, and the customer's not really on board with that, just make sure you address that. And, I recorded an episode with Patrick Lewis about dealing with conflict. And, if you haven't listened to that, go back and take a look and listen to that episode, because he has a lot of really good points in how to address situations like that when the customer is totally focused on implementing something that will cause a problem, or is something that you wouldn't do if this was your system. So go back and take a look at that. So again, always try to focus on your approach, which should be, my approach is going to be focused on effective solutions, is going to be focused on implementing solutions that will create the best results. And obviously that comes along with the whole idea of focusing on performance and focusing on putting yourself in the shoes of your customer's customer. So that's always the way to do it. So if I had to break down, I guess, my approach to user interface design and sort of thought process and architecture when it comes to it, I think I can break it up into 4 different phases or parts. One of them is I focus tremendously in insights, right? I don't like to just show data. I want the data to make us better in 3 separate, essentially life cycle phases, which is I want the data to help us get better at acquiring customers. I want the data that we have access to help us delivering the services or products those customers buy from us. And I want the data to help us retain those customers or extend the relationship we have with those customers. So if I can use my data to create new business offerings and new products that I can go to market with and get more business from my customer in the long run and extend that relationship I have with them, that's awesome. That's the data I want to do. And the customers that I'm working with right now, they know this, and customers that have worked with me in the past know this. I always say from day one, I say, when we start working on a project, I always say I only have one rule when it comes to Dynamics 365. As I mentioned, I'm the expert in Dynamics, and I'll be the one pushing for what's the best solution and best way to do something in Dynamics. But you always have a way to influence that. And the best way to influence that, which is the only rule, is you got to tell me how whatever you're asking for, whatever you're asking me to add or design in Dynamics helps us get better at acquiring customers, delivering services or products, or retaining those customers. If you tell me how what you're asking for helps us do that, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go 100% whiteboard consultant on that, right? So all you have to do is show me that. If we focus in your customer life cycle and the functionality or data or whatever you're asking me for helps us get better at any of those 3 things, or more than one if possible, then I'm going to do it. That's the only rule that I have. So again, whenever it comes to data in Dynamics, and this applies to everything, dashboards, charts, data, templates, you name it, anything, custom entities, security, whatever, anything within the solution, I always think about insights rather than just data, right? What kind of functionality and data do we need that will help us get better on any of those stages of the customer lifecycle? The next stage, as I mentioned, there's 4 of these parts when it comes to designing the user interface. So the first one was insights. The second one is I really like to focus in designing an intuitive user interface, something that goes with the flow, right? There's a navigational flow to it. I don't want any mental jarring where you have to go from one entity to another. It's like, how do I get there again? I love to implement solutions like business process flows and, design the form in a way that if you're filling up a form, it looks like the form that you're filling up, where you ask personal information at the top, and then below you ask for something else, and to the bottom you ask the last things you ask on. I want the navigation to be a flow, right? And on top of that, I want it to be automated. I want to add as much automation as possible. I want the users to expect something, and for that something they expect to happen, right? So if you expect that by closing a case as resolved, the system is going to email your customer and let them know what their resolution was, perfect. We're going to put that in place. I want this to be intuitive. And it's always funny when I hear, especially salespeople, when it comes to Dynamics 365, when they say, if you know how to use Office, you know how to use Dynamics, right? Because it's super intuitive. It's so easy. I really work on that. I really like to focus on making it so it's super intuitive. So again, piece number one of designing the user interface like an MVP is to focus on insights. Then the second part of that is making an intuitive user interface. Then the third portion of this is making sure that it's as simple as possible. Simplicity, right? And that's always rule number one when it comes to being a solution architect or a CRM administrator or a consultant or a developer, whatever it is. I always push for simplicity, right? Try to use functionality that is already in the system and make it simple, right? Get rid of all those unused features in Dynamics that your users are not going to use. And I talked last episode about using the app designer as one of those user magnets, right? That will help you achieve that. So the app designer is really, really good at hiding things that you shouldn't have access to, obviously in conjunction with your security configuration, security roles, your sitemap editor, all of that in place. Get rid of dirty data, right? Data from, customers that you don't work with anymore, 3-year-old leads you're never going to call, duplicate records. Get rid of all this dirty data. I want it to be simple, intuitive, to give you insights. If you can't trust your data, you're not going to get insights from that data. You're not going to believe it. You're not going to trust on it, right? If it's hard to find, it's not intuitive, it's hard to work with, make it simple. And I think all of these go hand in hand, right? I want single choices too. You will never see me on a user training talking about the 5 different ways you can create a contact record or the 6 different ways you can create a case record. I'll just tell you the easiest way. One way. I'm going to teach you one way to do it. This is the easiest way, and that's it. If you get an email and you have the Outlook client installed, or you have the Outlook connectivity in place or a synchronization in place, you get an email with a problem, take a look right here. Go ahead and track this email and then go ahead and create a case from it. You can convert an email into a case. That's the fastest way to go from an email that is reporting a problem to having a case in the system, and then automation will pick it up, route it, whatever at that point. So I always focus on this is the best way to do it. This is how you do it. This is how you do it here. This is how you do it there. One single choice, super simple, is the third pillar. And I realize that I've used a different name to describe this 4 different things that I focus on when it comes to designing my user interface, but let's just call them pillars going forward. So again, pillar number 1 is insights, then making it intuitive is the second pillar, then simplicity is the third, and fourth, I'm going to use performance for it, right? Now, I want to dig a little bit into performance, and that's why I left it fourth on the list of pillars that I focus on. And the reason for that is because when it comes to performance, I think a lot more about, again, the shoes of my customer's customer. I think a lot more about how can they perform better on their job. If you're a customer service agent or representative, or if you're a salesperson, or if you're a manager or the CEO, how can they perform better, their job better, right? It's part of how I design my UI. I need to understand if your UI should be better tuned for creation and consumption, for example, other than just analyzing the information that is in the system. So is it based on creation? Are you going to be adding a lot of records into the system? And if so, how are those records coming in? Is there any way we can automate that, right? So creation and consumption are two separate things. And if you need both of those things, then I need to approach each one of those separately. I want to focus on what kind of data you're creating, and then how do you consume it? What kind of insights we can get from the data that you're putting in place and the data other team members are putting in place, or maybe the company is putting in place via integration or something like that. Then again, I always focus on performance over functionality every time, right? And we want to talk about, common mistakes that people make when it comes to, designing Dynamics 365 user experience, especially when it comes to designing high-performing user interfaces, right? So for example, one common mistake that I've been waiting to tell you about is this idea of speed over outcomes. And what that means is that you're designing a user interface that contains the least amount of clicks, the fastest way to load everything. How can I make it so that you only hit a button and then everything gets done? That, honestly, I'm just telling you, in the real world is completely irrelevant. The fact that you have the fastest way to qualify a lead doesn't mean anything. And I've seen people spending hours, for example, trying to figure out what's the fastest way to resolve a case, what's the fastest way to resolve or qualify a lead, what's the fastest way to close an opportunity that has 3 quotes on it. Who cares what's the fastest way to do it? Because you need to focus in outcomes, not in speed. Speed is not a way to measure the user interface, right? If you have to make 20 calls and I spend all this money to make sure that, you can make the calls the fastest. You have an auto dialer. You just sit there and hit a button in the middle of the screen that says next. And you just hit next. And another user pops up in the phone and you say, hi, this is Gus Gonzalez. I'm calling you from, Elevate Solutions. And I'm trying to sell you whatever. And you hang up on me. No problem. I just hit on that big button that says next. Boom. The next customer is patched in. And I have to call on average 20 people to make a sell, right? Versus someone who has to click a few times, maybe look at a few screens, but every time they call, they finish the sell. Or maybe they finish the sell, 8 out of 10 calls. Now, who's getting better outcomes, right? Who's going to be happier? The guy that, just hits on the next button and gets somebody patched in and selling 1 out of 20? Or the person selling almost every time? Because you're delivering a UI that provides insights, that is intuitive, that is simple to use, right? You, as a salesperson, making calls and trying to sell stuff will perform better. Your outcomes will be better. So having fast speeds and clicking and all of that stuff, speed is not an indication of performance when it comes to the user interface. At least not in my book, right? Calculating clicks is a measure of UI, user interface. You can measure UI based on the amount of clicks it takes you to make a phone call or to, resolve a case or whatever. That's fine. But who cares? When you implemented Dynamics 365, when I implement Dynamics 365, my number one priority is to drive business, is to make sure your organization grows, it sells better, it beats competitors. Who cares if I can reduce the number of clicks? That means nothing if the company is not doing its job and growing and beating competition and getting better at acquiring customers and all of the stuff I just talked about before. So calculating clicks is simply measuring the UI, not the user experience. And remember that the UI is not going to adapt itself. Your solution is going to be adopted by users. So because of that, the user experience is more important than the user interface, if that makes sense. So in order for me to increase my user experience, I am not thinking about what's the least amount of clicking that the user has to do their jobs. My number one priority is to drive business. My number one priority is not to reduce clicks. My number one priority is how can I make you, user, regardless of your title and what you do for the company, be better at your job with Dynamics 365 than without it. So for those of you out there that sort of take it to the extreme and say, well, for me, UI is all about putting everything in one screen, one click for everything. That's not user experience, though. That's one thing that you need to think about. So here's a simple question. Sometimes I ask customers or people who bring this up about the whole speed situation when it comes to user interface. If you could increase first time close for service calls, because I've been using only sales, so let's talk about customer service on this one. If you could increase first time closing of service calls, meaning tickets, by 50%, would it be worth adding 2 extra clicks to the process? Or do you really need to have the fastest way to create cases? What if I can provide you with enough information and insight so that you might not have the fastest way to enter a case? Maybe it will take a couple more clicks, but then you create half the amount of cases because you're able to resolve these cases on the first time they call you. And how does that translate into customer satisfaction? The fact that you're not just mindlessly creating cases that could have been resolved on the first time they call you. Wouldn't that user experience be better? Wouldn't that customer experience be better? Wouldn't the business, grow because of a solution like that? So this is a good example of why adding clicks to the UI might be detrimental to your click to result ratio or whatever, if you have that, but it will be better for the user experience and for the business. Here's another question. If you could increase your opportunity win rate by 10% by adding 4 extra clicks to the way you drive opportunities, for example, you go through the process or close them, would it be worth adding 4 extra clicks? I mean, what's 10% opportunities, right? If your average opportunity out there is a revenue of $50,000, wouldn't it be worth 10% to just add 4 more clicks to the existing behavior or to what you expect? Almost every single business you ask questions like these will pick business outcomes other than faster UI. So, high-performing user interface is not about how fast you can navigate through it. And, the example that we had before with Power Apps, having a Power App that loads super fast is a good indication of that. Just because you can load your app fastest doesn't mean it performs better in terms of the user interface and the experience of the user that you get. And once again, people listening to this might disagree with me. You might think that having faster results is better, or the fact that you could do it super fast with a green button in the middle of the screen that says next, and that you would still be able to provide enough information to close cases or to sell on every call that you make. Maybe the problem is the script. Maybe it's that we're not using Unified Service Desk. Maybe it's the tool, right? Again, I don't think that most solution architects approach this user interface portion of a solution with the right mindset, which again focuses on those 4 pillars that I've been talking about: insights over data, making it intuitive, having a simple first approach, right? So simplicity is paramount, and obviously focusing on performance for the business. And performance for the business means performance for the users themselves, not so much for how quickly we can get a task done, but how effective are we at creating that task. Earlier, I mentioned the example of Metrobank, and Metrobank has a really good story when it comes to putting, their customers ahead of their users. There was one story, and I'm probably going to butcher this, and you can look this up online. I'm sure that it has more details, but from what I remember from this story, there was a lady calling Metrobank on a Friday early in the morning and asking what her account balance was. And somebody answered the phone, obviously, and gave her the account balance, and it was, I don't know, 57 pounds, whatever it is. The lady said, okay, thank you very much, hung up, and that was like early in the morning, like 9:30 a.m. Then later on, around 11:30, she called again and asked for her account balance. And the agent that picked up the phone at that point provided the balance. She said, all right, thank you. The balance was the same. Then around 1 p.m. or so, 1:30 p.m., the lady called and asked for the balance again. And the agent that picked it up in that afternoon was empowered by the user interface to see what interactions had taken place before and what were the nature of the interactions. And when the lady asked for her account balance again, the agent said, I can see that you've called a couple times today to ask about it. Are you concerned about your security, of your account? Are you concerned that somebody has access to it, whatever it was? And the lady said, no, I'm getting paid today, and I need to buy a ticket to go see my mom who's sick. And the interface that the agent was using allowed to see all of the activities from this customer. So they have this customer 360-degree view that allowed the agent to see that it was true that on the last Friday of the month, this lady was paid automatically, and she had been a customer for years and it's never missed that particular Friday, the last Friday of the month. So he was able to make an exception. I think it was something for like £500 to deposit into the account so the lady can buy the ticket to go see her mom because of that prior history of activity within the account, and from that prior history of activities from the customer service side on the lady calling to ask for her account balance. So I don't know 100% if that story is correct or if it's accurate, but I remember reading that before, and that is always a good indication of putting your customer ahead of your users, or in my case as a partner, putting my customer's customer ahead of my own customer, my users, right? So that's always to keep in mind, putting yourself on those shoes. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to wrap up essentially this episode with a list of things to do when it comes to designing the user interface. And if you're taking notes, I always encourage you to take notes in some of these episodes because I'll be sharing some best practices that I never really blogged about or talked about in public. Maybe I'll cover them, at a conference here and there, but not everyone can go to those. So one of the things that I wanted to do is to talk about what are some of the things, what are some of the items on my to-do list when it comes to designing the user interface. So number one is I always keep my eye on form load, right? I always want to have my static information at the top, the stuff that almost never changes, right? So in the case of account name, account number, stuff like that. So right at the top, I always want to load the right form by default. So if we have multiple forms, because I have multiple different kinds of users and they all have access to, different forms or whatever it is, I always want to load up the right form by default. I don't want them switching forms, right? And that's something I can do by working with App Designer plus security roles within the forms themselves. I always want to load related information for all the departments, depending on what department you're coming from. So if you are on the IT department, for example, and you load the IT form, I want to show IT related information to that customer. If you're on the marketing side, marketing related information, and so on. So I always focus on that. And then any rarely used data, I always put it into collapse sections, right? I never just leave it out there. So for example, just to use the example of IT again, if you're at the IT department, you might not need to see people's passwords or the user's password all the time. So I can add that information into a collapse area, or IP addresses, or what licenses they have, things like that. You might not need that information all the time, so I collapse it. When it comes to iframes, for example, sometimes you do want some iframes on the page. They achieve something very useful. I talked about iframes on the last episode when it came to user adoption magnets. Iframes are great, but you can add them into a collapse section so that when you open the section, the iframe will load at that point, not loading within the form every time a record is open. Unless every time you open the record, you expect the information on those iframes, right? If that's the case, then that's fine. You add them to it, even though they're going to delay the form. But if there's no other reason to go to that form other than to access those iframes, then I see how I would add it as well on a expanded section at that point. The other thing is you always want to try to minimize white space which the new user interface does very well, right? They compartmentalize the sections and tabs within the form in a really good way that minimizes white space, but always try hard, never leave a bunch of spaces around in the form. So minimizing white space is one of the things on my to-do list when it comes to user interface. Obviously, always focus in task completion, right? I don't want to I don't want to have forms and views in place that you just enter some information but you don't finish there. You want to always focus in task completions. Business process flows are a good example of having a task completion mindset where you have different stages and steps to accomplish as part of that. So when it comes to a case, for example, I never want to have it so if you need to process something external like a warranty or a refund, you need to go and start that outside of the case. I want them to be able to do it within the case, or at least a grid within the case. Anything they need to accomplish a particular task. I'm not saying that you have to accomplish a particular task with just one entity and that's it. You can use multiple entities, but try to make it so the task can be accomplished in one place as well. And obviously enable what I call my user experience accelerators. And I talked about some of these accelerators when it came to user adoption magnets on the last episode, but I wanted to talk about 5 specific accelerators when it comes to user interface. These are user interface alone, and that's why I didn't really talk about it on the last episode. I was saving them for this particular episode. So number 1, I love what I call landing zone dashboards. This whole concept of your command center. So depending on what kind of user you are, when you log in into Dynamics, you land on this dashboard that tells you exactly what you're doing, right? I call this, what is the next best action? If I can see the next best action in place, ready to go for me to get started, that's awesome, right? That's what I'm going to focus on. On the last episode, I talked about using scoring, like lead scoring, account scoring, case scoring, whatever it is, to prioritize the kind of records you're going to be working with. That's perfect for a landing zone dashboard. I want to show the priority of records and things that you have coming up, whether that's activities that you need to complete or quotes you have to send, contracts you have to renew, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is. I want you to have a landing zone dashboard, okay, where you land and you have everything at a glance and you can start working from there. Also, we talked about this in the past, editable grids, right? So that's always a good accelerator when it comes to entering things, especially when you're thinking about that task completion mindset that I mentioned earlier. So if you have that task completion mindset and you're performing something that might be accomplished in a separate entity, adding an editable grid inside the form can help you do that faster. Or maybe you do it on the grid on the main view within the entity, but that's also something that can speed up the experience for the user if they're entering a bunch of data. Quick view forms is another one, so that's number 3 on the list. Number 4 is quick create forms. Again, these forms are easy because in a quick view form, you have this sort of window or a glimpse into another record, a parent record. So in the case, for example, we can see who the customer is, their phone number, maybe their primary contact information, maybe what kind of SLA or entitlement they have. You can show all of this stuff, or maybe their currency if I'm looking at it from the opportunity or quote point of view. So I can show some information that it's valuable and it's easier for me to accomplish my task. I don't have to navigate away to the account form to pull some information that I need every time I'm going to be working with a case or with a quote or with an opportunity or whatever, right? So I want to show it all with a quick view form, and the same with quick create forms. And quick create forms, I've mentioned this in the past. Again, depending on what episode you've listened to before, I love to use quick create forms for duplicate detection as well. Not just for the idea that I can quickly create a record in Dynamics, but also how quickly I can actually find out if this record is a duplicate. So what I typically do when it comes to quick create forms is I strip out all of the fields that I don't have included on duplicate detection rules, and I only leave those in duplicate detection rules because what I don't want is for the user to spend 10, 15 minutes entering a bunch of data into a record, manually copying and pasting, researching, whatever. And then when they click save, they get a message that says there's a duplicate in the system. What are you going to do? I'll tell you what they're going to do. They're going to hit save because they just spent 10 minutes typing in information. If they don't hit save, they hit cancel because it's a duplicate, they're going to be frustrated anyway. So they're going to be either frustrated and unhappy and feeling worthless because they just enter all this information, or they're going to feel, frustrated, but now you have duplicates in the system, which destroy the whole idea of insights because your data is duplicate and no one trusts it. So you have, having quick create forms really helps you when it comes to duplicate detection. Again, if I'm only checking for the email address, maybe first name, last name, and email address, or last name and email address, when it comes to a duplicate contact, for example, that's all I'm going to ask. Give me the name, last name, and email address. Boom. Now I'm going to check if there's a duplicate. If there's no duplicate, go ahead, move on and add the other 80 fields that we need to know for that particular contact record or opportunity or whatever it is, right? So if you're entering an opportunity and you're selecting what kind of project you're going to be working on, who the customer is, maybe an estimated revenue, you might say, okay, this opportunity seems like it's already in the system. I'm just throwing examples. So you want to ask the minimum amount of information that you can within a quick create form to check for duplicates if that's something that you're doing, which you should be doing, and then move on from there. Then ask other questions once we know that we don't have a duplicate in the system or that a duplicate is unlikely based on the duplicate detection rules that you have in place. Lastly, and number 5 on my list of UX accelerators, is using business process flows, especially when the flow considers multiple entities. As you know, we can go up to 5 different entities within the same business process flow. And remember, earlier I was talking about intuitive, right? And having having a solution that is intuitive is one of the pillars within my design of user interface and my rules of designing user interface. And when you have a process that includes all of the entities you need to get to in order to accomplish a process or a task or whatever you're doing, then that really, really helps you, right? So business process flows, which I could spend a whole episode just talking about business process flows and the best practices and approach I take when it comes to designing those and why milestones are so important and all of that stuff. But business process flows are one of those things that is a great UX accelerator. So, to wrap up this session, I just want to mention that the user experience goes beyond a great user interface. Just having the prettiest colors and all these buttons and all these iframes and all of that might earn you the user interface Nobel Prize, but it doesn't mean that your users are going to have a great experience, right? So user experience is more important than whatever you use to measure your user interface. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that, we talked about it in user adoption magnets on the last episode, when it comes to data integration, right? And the fact that you're looking at data and having data that users don't normally have access to and how that helps them keep coming back into Dynamics 365. You also want to think about the performance when it comes to integrating to the data. And it's always shocking to see how many people create real-time or near real-time integrations to data that rarely changes. I've seen real-time, integrations with AR data, right? Or credit, for example, data that companies evaluate once a month. What's the line of credit? How much, what's the most credit you can get from us? They evaluate that once a month, but however, here we go. Every time you open an account in real time, I'm going to go and check your credit worthiness or whatever within the company. It just doesn't make any sense at all. So keep your data integration performance in mind. Obviously, this goes hand in hand with security performance. We talked about it at length on episode 19, one of our most popular episodes, Designing Security Like an MVP. Again, having a good performing security architecture in place and infrastructure in place is a great thing to have. Don't abuse real-time workflows. We talked a little bit about this on the This versus That episode a couple of episodes ago when we talked about using real-time versus background workflows, right? The more you do with real-time workflows, and I realize that people want that feedback to be immediate. But the more you do it real time, the slower the user experience is going to be. The user interface is going to be. It's not going to be super slow, right? If it's a simple workflow, it's not going to sit there for 30 seconds. It's going to happen really fast. But still, like I mentioned in previous episodes before, a friend of mine that served in the military, he told me that ounces equals pounds, right? And that's why he takes off things like the tags on your zippers and, whatever weight that might be like, man, really just a tag? How much is that going to add to you and the kit that you have? Yeah, that's just a tab, but then 5 tabs and this thing and that thing. Next thing you know, you have 2 or 3 extra pounds you have to carry through the desert in Iraq, right? While you're deployed. So little things like that. Real-time workflows that might not seem on their own that are going to make too much damage. Once you add it to a bunch of other workflows and a bunch of users running all of these all at once, it will add up. So don't abuse real-time workflows. Obviously, think outside the CRM box, right? That's another thing that you have to keep in mind. The more you process outside of Dynamics, the faster Dynamics is going to perform. However, the more you stay away from maybe a task completion mindset or a business driver and business outcome mindset. Yes, having an app and Power App will be outside of Dynamics, so that way users won't have to access that. But if me as a user have to do half on the computer and half on a Power App or something, if it's going to prevent me and take me away from the flow of things, yeah, even though you're technically processing stuff outside of Dynamics, which means Dynamics is working faster, doesn't really mean my user experience is better though. So keep that in mind as well. However, if you can process something outside of, Dynamics 365 in Azure or something like that, which will not disrupt the flow of things and the intuitive solution you're putting in place, but still process outside of Dynamics so that Dynamics is performing as high as possible, that's awesome. So keep thinking outside the CRM box for sure. And last episode, we talked about the user assurance cycle, right? If it's not in CRM, it doesn't exist. That's also another one that will keep you coming back. And that's another one that is going to also drive innovation within your user experience. So sometimes I'm not going to say that I design every single user interface perfectly. That's never going to change because it's perfect. That's not the case. The users, as they keep coming back to use the solution, they'll have feedback. That's why we have user adoption sessions right after we go live with Dynamics, because as they come back into the system, they'll be the ones providing you with the feedback that you need in order to improve your user interface. And the user interface will evolve, right? It's supposed to. As you get better results, you'll think of better ways to have better outcomes when it comes to leveraging Dynamics. So I fully expect the user interface to change, but in order for it to change, the changes have to come from the users. And if it's not in CRM, it doesn't exist. You need to keep those users coming back. And obviously, listen to our episode on beautifying Dynamics 365. There's a ton of stuff we discussed there. There's an episode I recorded with Ulrich Carlson, another CRM MVP, where we talk about all of our tips to beautify Dynamics 365, modify the way it works in a few ways out of the box that we disagree with, and making sure that Dynamics is really set up for to get the best user experience out of it as possible. Best user experience normally combines with the best results for the users and for the organization as a whole, and for you as a solution architect, since you're focused 100% on creating and implementing effective solutions when it comes to Dynamics 365. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the CRM MVP podcast. We're off to a great start in 2019. We have a lot more to come, tons of conferences to attend this year. We have the MVP Summit coming soon in March. Looking forward to that and the great discussions we're going to have. But you're always driving this program, this show. So if you have any recommendations for future episodes or any recommendations for future guests, sometimes I get recommendations for me to talk to some people. Some people are pretty elusive, actually, but I'll be reaching out to some of you in the future as well. You can always drop me a line, as I mentioned, info@crmvppodcast.com. Obviously, follow us on Twitter @crmvppodcast and share the show with your colleagues and the people who are out there doing this thing with you in the battlefield. of the Dynamics 365 Battlefield. Share the show with them. Let them know that you enjoyed it, or give me your feedback. Again, I don't expect all of you to agree 100% with me. I'm fully expecting that, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. But as always, thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.